Summa Contra Gentiles, first book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Translator's Preface. 15 years ago, the English Dominican Fathers embarked on what was considered by many the hazardous and even useless venture of translating the Summa Theologica of the Angelic Doctor. Yet although there were critics adverse to the project, there were others, not a few, who approved and encouraged. These, and the favor with which the effort, notwithstanding its many deficiencies, was received, heartened the translators to persevere, and enabled them to bring their work to a happy conclusion. For the venture has proved a success beyond the most sanguine expectations, and already the work has entered into a second edition. During the progress of translating the Summa Theologica, the translators were frequently asked why they had given preference to this work over the Summa Contra Gentiles. The reason is a simple one. The Latin text of the latter work, edited by P.A. Uccelli in 1857, was extremely defective, owing to the editor's inability to read St. Thomas's handwriting correctly. Father Peter Paul Mackey, who has been on the staff of the editors of the Leonine edition of St. Thomas's works for 40 years, told the writer of this preface that it took him over 2 years to learn how to read St. Thomas's autograph. It was not till 1918 that the above editors published the first 2 books of the Summa Contra Gentiles. Hence the delay in the translation. It is hoped that the English translation will receive the same indulgence and favor as that which has been recorded to the translation of the Summa Theologica. The Summa Contra Gentiles, first book, chapter 1. In what consists the office of a wise man? My mouth shall meditate truth, and my lips shall hate wickedness. Proverbs 8, verse 7. The general use which, in the philosopher's opinion, should be followed in naming things, has resulted in those men being called wise, who direct things themselves and govern them well. Wherefore, among other things which men conceive of the wise man, the philosopher reckons that it belongs to the wise man to direct things. Now the rule of all things directed to the end of government and order must needs be taken from their end. For then is a thing best disposed when it is fittingly directed to its end, since the end of everything is its good. Wherefore in the arts we observe that the art which governs and rules another is the one to which the latter's end belongs. Thus the medical art rules and directs the art of the druggist, because health, which is the object of medicine, is the end of all drugs which are made up by the druggist's art. The same may be observed in the art of sailing in relation to the art of shipbuilding, and in the military art in relation to the equestrian art and all warlike appliances. These arts which govern others are called master arts, architectonicae, that is, principal arts, for which reason their craftsmen, who are called master craftsmen, architectores, are awarded the name of wise men. Since, however, these same craftsmen, through being occupied with the ends of certain singular things, do not attain to the universal end of all things, they are called wise about this or that, in which sense it is said in 1 Corinthians 3 verse 10, "As a wise architect I have laid the foundation," whereas the name of being wise simply is reserved to him alone, whose consideration is about the end of the universe, which end is also the beginning of the universe. Wherefore, according to the philosopher, it belongs to the wise man to consider the highest causes. Now the last end of each thing is that which is intended by the first author or mover of that thing. and the first author and mover of the universe is an intellect, as we shall prove further on. Consequently, the last end of the universe must be the good of the intellect, and this is truth. Therefore, truth must be the last end of the whole universe, and the consideration thereof must be the chief occupation of wisdom. And for this reason, divine wisdom, clothed in flesh, declares that he came into the world to make known the truth, saying, in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 37, "For this I was born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should give testimony to the truth." Moreover, the philosopher defines the first philosophy as being the knowledge of truth, not of any truth, but of that truth which is the source of all truth, of that, namely, which relates to the first principle of being of all things. Wherefore its truth is the principle of all truth, since the disposition of things is the same in truth as in being. Now it belongs to the same thing to pursue one contrary and to remove the other. Thus medicine which affects health removes sickness. Hence, just as it belongs to a wise man to meditate and disseminate truth, especially about the first principle, so does it belong to him to refute contrary falsehood. Wherefore the twofold office of the wise man is fittingly declared from the mouth of wisdom in the words above quoted, namely, to meditate and publish the divine truth, which antonomastically is the truth, as signified by the words, "My mouth shall meditate truth," and to refute the error contrary to truth, as signified by the words, "And my lips shall hate wickedness," by which is denoted falsehood opposed to divine truth, which falsehood is contrary to religion, that is also called godliness. Wherefore the falsehood that is contrary thereto receives the name of ungodliness. Chapter 2. The author's intention in this work. Now of all human pursuits, that of wisdom is the most perfect, the most sublime, the most profitable, the most delightful. It is the most perfect, since in proportion as a man devotes himself to the pursuit of wisdom, so much does he already share in true happiness. Wherefore the wise man says in Ecclesiasticus 14:22, "Blessed is the man that shall continue in wisdom." It is the most sublime, because thereby especially does man approach to a likeness to God, who made all things in wisdom. Wherefore, since likeness is the cause of love, the pursuit of wisdom especially unites man to God by friendship. Hence it is said in Wisdom 7:14 that wisdom is an infinite treasure to men, which they that use become the friends of God. It is most profitable, because by wisdom itself man is brought to the kingdom of immortality, for the desire of wisdom bringeth to the everlasting kingdom. Wisdom 6:21. And it is the most delightful, because her conversation hath no bitterness, nor her company any tediousness, but joy and gladness. Wisdom 8:16. Wherefore, taking heart from God's loving kindness to assume the office of a wise man, although it surpasses our own powers, the purpose we have in view is, in our own weak way, to declare the truth which the Catholic faith professes, while weeding out contrary errors. For in the words of Hilary, "I acknowledge that I owe my life's chief occupation to God, so that every word and every thought of mine may speak of him." But it is difficult to refute the errors of each individual for two reasons. First, because the sacrilegious assertions of each erring individual are not so well known to us that we are able from what they say to find arguments and refute their errors. For the doctors of old used this method in order to confute the errors of the heathens whose opinions they were able to know, since either they had been heathens themselves or had lived among heathens and were conversant with their teachings. Secondly, because some of them, like the Mohammedans and pagans, do not agree with us as to the authority of any scripture whereby they may be convinced, in the same way as we are able to dispute with the Jews by means of the Old Testament and with heretics by means of the New, whereas the former accept neither. Wherefore it is necessary to have recourse to natural reason, to which all are compelled to assent, and yet this is deficient in the things of God. And while we are occupied in the inquiry about a particular truth, we shall show what errors are excluded thereby, and how demonstrable truth is in agreement with the faith of the Christian religion. Chapter 3. In what way it is possible to make known the divine truth. Since, however, not every truth is to be made known in the same way, and it is the part of an educated man to seek for conviction in each subject, only so far as the nature of the subject allows, as the philosopher most rightly observes as quoted by Boethius, it is necessary to show first of all in what way it is possible to make known the aforesaid truth. Now in those things which we hold about God, there is truth in two ways. For certain things that are true about God wholly surpass the capability of human reason. For instance, that God is three and one, while there are certain things to which even natural reason can attain, for instance, that God is one, and others like these which even the philosophers proved demonstratively of God, being guided by the light of natural reason. That certain divine truths wholly surpass the capability of human reason is most clearly evident. For since the principle of all the knowledge which the reason acquires about a thing is the understanding of that thing's essence, because according to the philosopher's teaching, the principle of a demonstration is what a thing is, it follows that our knowledge about a thing will be in proportion to our understanding of its essence. Wherefore, if the human intellect comprehends the essence of a particular thing, for instance a stone or a triangle, no truth about that thing will surpass the capability of human reason. But this does not happen to us in relation to God, because the human intellect is incapable, by its natural power, of attaining to the comprehension of his essence. Since our intellect's knowledge, according to the mode of the present life, originates from the senses, so that things which are not objects of sense cannot be comprehended by the human intellect, except insofar as knowledge of them is gathered from sensibles. Now sensibles cannot lead our intellect to see in them what God is, because they are effects unequal to the power of their cause. And yet our intellect is led by sensibles to the divine knowledge so as to know about God that He is, and other such truths which need to be ascribed to the first principle. Accordingly, some divine truths are attainable by human reason, while others altogether surpass the power of human reason. Again, the same is easy to see from the degrees of intellects. For if one of two men perceives a thing with his intellect with greater subtlety, the one whose intellect is of a higher degree understands many things which the other is altogether unable to grasp, as instanced in a yokel who is utterly incapable of grasping the subtleties of philosophy. Now the angelic intellect surpasses the human intellect more than the intellect of the cleverest philosopher surpasses that of the most uncultured. For an angel knows God through a more excellent effect than does man, forasmuch as the angel's essence, through which he is led to know God by natural knowledge, is more excellent than sensible things, even than the soul itself by which the human intellect mounts to the knowledge of God. And the divine intellect surpasses the angelic intellect much more than the angelic surpasses the human. For the divine intellect, by its capacity, equals the divine essence, wherefore God perfectly understands of himself what he is, and he knows all things that can be understood about him, whereas the angel knows not what God is by his natural knowledge, because the angel's essence, by which he is led to the knowledge of God, is in effect unequal to the power of its cause. Consequently, an angel is unable by his natural knowledge to grasp all that God understands about himself, nor again is human reason capable of grasping all that an angel understands by his natural power. Accordingly, just as a man would show himself to be a most insane fool if he declared the assertions of a philosopher to be false because he was unable to understand them, so, and much more, a man would be exceedingly foolish were he to suspect of falsehood the things revealed by God through the ministry of his angels, because they cannot be the object of reason's investigations. Furthermore, the same is made abundantly clear by the deficiency which every day we experience in our knowledge of things. For we are ignorant of many of the properties of sensible things, and in many cases we are unable to discover the nature of those properties which we perceive by our senses. Much less, therefore, is human reason capable of investigating all the truths about that most sublime essence. With this, the saying of the philosopher is in accord, where he says that our intellect, in relation to those primary things which are most evident in nature, is like the eye of a bat in relation to the sun. To this truth, Holy Writ also bears witness. For it is written in Job 11:7, "Peradventure thou wilt comprehend the steps of God, and wilt find out the Almighty perfectly?" And in chapter 36, verse 26, "Behold, God is great, exceeding our knowledge." And in 1 Corinthians 13:9, "We know in part." Therefore, all that is said about God, though it cannot be investigated by reason, must not be forthwith rejected as false, as the Manichaeans and many unbelievers have thought. Chapter 4. That the truth about divine things which is attainable by reason is fittingly proposed to man as an object of belief. While then the truth of the intelligible things of God is twofold, one to which the inquiry of reason can attain, the other which surpasses the whole range of human reason, both are fittingly proposed by God to man as an object of belief. We must first show this with regard to that truth which is attainable by the inquiry of reason, lest it appears to some that since it can be attained by reason, it was useless to make it an object of faith by supernatural inspiration. Now 3 disadvantages would result if this truth were left solely to the inquiry of reason. One is that few men would have knowledge of God, because very many are hindered from gathering the fruit of diligent inquiry, which is the discovery of truth, for 3 reasons. Some indeed on account of an indisposition of temperament, by reason of which many are naturally indisposed to knowledge, so that no efforts of theirs would enable them to reach to the attainment of the highest degree of human knowledge, which consists in knowing God. Some are hindered by the needs of household affairs, for there must needs be among men some that devote themselves to the conduct of temporal affairs, who would be unable to devote so much time to the leisure of contemplative research as to reach the summit of human inquiry, namely the knowledge of God. And some are hindered by laziness. For in order to acquire the knowledge of God in those things which reason is able to investigate, it is necessary to have a previous knowledge of many things, since almost the entire consideration of philosophy is directed to the knowledge of God, for which reason metaphysics, which is about divine things, is the last of the parts of philosophy to be studied. Wherefore, it is not possible to arrive at the inquiry about the aforesaid truth except after a most laborious study, and few are willing to take upon themselves this labor for the love of a knowledge, the natural desire for which has nevertheless been instilled into the mind of man by God. The second disadvantage is that those who would arrive at the discovery of the aforesaid truth would scarcely succeed in doing so after a long time. First, because this truth is so profound that it is only after long practice that the human intellect is enabled to grasp it by means of reason. Secondly, because many things are required beforehand, as stated above. Thirdly, because at the time of youth, the mind, when tossed about by the various movements of the passions, is not fit for the knowledge of so sublime a truth, whereas calm gives prudence and knowledge, as is stated in the 7th book of Physics. Hence mankind would remain in the deepest darkness of ignorance if the path of reason were the only available way to the knowledge of God, because the knowledge of God, which especially makes men perfect and good, would be acquired only by the few, and by these only after a long time. The third disadvantage is that much falsehood is mingled with the investigations of human reason, on account of the weakness of our intellect in forming its judgments, and by reason of the admixture of phantasms. Consequently, many would remain in doubt about those things even which are most truly demonstrated, through ignoring the force of the demonstration, especially when they perceive that different things are taught by the various men who are called wise. Moreover, among the many demonstrated truths, there is sometimes a mixture of falsehood that is not demonstrated, but assumed for some probable or sophistical reason which at times is mistaken for a demonstration. Therefore, it was necessary that definite certainty and pure truth about divine things should be offered to man by the way of faith. Accordingly, the divine clemency has made this salutary commandment, that even some things which reason is able to investigate must be held by faith, so that all may share in the knowledge of God easily and without doubt or error. Hence it is written in Ephesians 4 verses 17 and 18 that, "Henceforward you walk not, as also the Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having their understanding darkened." And in Isaiah chapter 54 verse 13, "All thy children shall be taught of the Lord." Chapter 5. That those things which cannot be investigated by reason are fittingly proposed to man as an object of faith. It may appear to some that those things which cannot be investigated by reason ought not to be proposed to man as an object of faith, because divine wisdom provides for each thing according to the mode of its nature. We must therefore prove that it is necessary also for those things which surpass reason to be proposed by God to man as an object of faith. For no man tends to do a thing by his desire and endeavor unless it be previously known to him. Wherefore, since a man is directed by divine providence to a higher good than human frailty can attain in the present life, as we shall show in the sequel, it was necessary for his mind to be bidden to something higher than those things to which our reason can reach in the present life, so that he might learn to aspire, and by his endeavors, to tend to something surpassing the whole state of the present life. And this is especially competent to the Christian religion, which alone promises goods spiritual and eternal, for which reason it proposes many things surpassing the thought of man, whereas the old law, which contained promises of temporal things, proposed few things that are above human inquiry. It was with this motive that the philosophers, in order to wean men from sensible pleasures to virtue, took care to show that there are other goods of greater account than those which appeal to the senses, the taste of which things affords much greater delight to those who devote themselves to active or contemplative virtues. Again, it is necessary for this truth to be proposed to man as an object of faith in order that he may have truer knowledge of God. For then alone do we know God truly, when we believe that he is far above all that man can possibly think of God, because the divine essence surpasses man's natural knowledge, as stated above. Hence, by the fact that certain things about God are proposed to man, which surpass his reason, he is strengthened in his opinion that God is far above what he is able to think. There results also another advantage from this, namely, the checking of presumption, which is the mother of error. For some there are who presume so far on their wits that they think themselves capable of measuring the whole nature of things by their intellect, in that they esteem all things true which they see, and false which they see not. Accordingly, in order that man's mind might be freed from this presumption and seek the truth humbly, it was necessary that certain things far surpassing his intellect should be proposed to man by God. Yet another advantage is made apparent by the words of the philosopher in the 10th book of Ethics. For when a certain Simonides maintained that man should neglect the knowledge of God and apply his mind to human affairs, and declared that a man ought to relish human things and immortal mortal things, the philosopher contradicted him, saying that a man ought to devote himself to immortal and divine things as much as he can. Hence he says that though it is but little that we perceive of higher substances, yet that little is more loved and desired than all the knowledge we have of lower substances. He says also in the 2nd book of De Cielo et Mundo that when questions about the heavenly bodies can be answered by a short and probable solution, it happens that the hearer is very much rejoiced. All this shows that, however imperfect the knowledge of the highest things may be, it bestows very great perfection on the soul, and consequently, although human reason is unable to grasp fully things that are above reason, it nevertheless acquires much perfection, if at least it holds things in any way whatever by faith. Wherefore it is written in Ecclesiasticus 3:25, "Many things are shown to thee above the understanding of men," and in 1 Corinthians 2, verses 10 and 11, "The things that are of God no man knoweth, but the Spirit of God. But to us God hath revealed them by his Spirit." Chapter 6. That it is not a mark of levity to assent to the things that are of faith, although they are above reason. Now those who believe this truth, of which reason affords a proof, believe not lightly as though following foolish fables. Confer 2 Peter 1:16. For divine wisdom himself, who knows all things most fully, deigned to reveal to man the secrets of God's wisdom. Confer Job 11:6. And by suitable arguments proves his presence and the truth of his doctrine and inspiration, by performing works surpassing the capability of the whole of nature, namely, the wondrous healing of the sick, the raising of the dead to life, a marvelous control over the heavenly bodies, and what excites yet more wonder, the inspiration of human minds, so that unlettered and simple persons are filled with the Holy Ghost, and in one instant are endowed with the most sublime wisdom and eloquence. And after considering these arguments, convinced by the strength of the proof, and not by the force of arms, nor by the promise of delights, but, and this is the greatest marvel of all, amidst the tyranny of persecutions, a countless crowd of not only simple but also of the wisest men embraced the Christian faith, which inculcates things surpassing all human understanding, curbs the pleasures of the flesh, and teaches contempt of all worldly things. That the minds of mortal beings should assent to such things is both the greatest of miracles and the evident work of divine inspiration, seeing that they despise visible things and desire only those that are invisible, and that this happened not suddenly nor by chance, but by the disposition of God, is shown by the fact that God foretold that he would do so by the manifold oracles of the prophets, whose books we hold in veneration as bearing witness to our faith. This particular kind of proof is alluded to in the words of Hebrews 2, verses 3 and 4, which, namely the salvation of mankind, having begun to be declared by the Lord, was confirmed with us by them that heard him, God also bearing witness by signs and wonders and diverse distributions of the Holy Ghost. Now such a wondrous conversion of the world to the Christian faith is a most indubitable proof that such signs did take place, so that there is no need to repeat them, seeing that there is evidence of them in their result. For it would be the most wondrous sign of all if without any wondrous signs the world were persuaded by simple and lowly men to believe things so arduous, to accomplish things so difficult, and to hope for things so sublime. Although God ceases not even in our time to work miracles through his saints in confirmation of the faith. On the other hand, those who introduced the errors of the sects proceeded in contrary fashion, as instanced by Muhammad, who enticed peoples with the promise of carnal pleasures, to the desire of which the concupiscence of the flesh instigates. He also delivered commandments, in keeping with his promises, by giving the reins to carnal pleasure, wherein it is easy for carnal men to obey. And the lessons of truth which he inculcated were only such as can be easily known to any man of average wisdom by his natural powers. Yea, rather the truths which he taught were mingled by him with many fables and most false doctrines. Nor did he add any signs of supernatural agency, which alone are a fitting witness to divine inspiration, since a visible work that can be from God alone proves the teacher of truth to be invisibly inspired. But he asserted that he was sent in the power of arms, a sign that is not lacking even to robbers and tyrants. Again, those who believed in him from the outset were not wise men practiced in things divine and human, but beast-like men who dwelt in the wilds, utterly ignorant of all divine teaching, and it was by a multitude of such men and the force of arms that he compelled others to submit to his law. Lastly, no divine oracles of prophets in a previous age bore witness to him. Rather did he corrupt almost all the teaching of the Old and New Testaments by a narrative replete with fables, as one may see by a perusal of his law. Hence, by a cunning device, he did not commit the reading of the Old and New Testament books to his followers, lest he should thereby be convicted of falsehood. Thus it is evident that those who believe his words believe lightly. Chapter 7. That the truth of reason is not in opposition to the truth of the Christian faith. Now, though the aforesaid truth of the Christian faith surpasses the ability of human reason, nevertheless, those things which are naturally instilled in human reason cannot be opposed to this truth. For it is clear that those things which are implanted in reason by nature are most true, so much so that it is impossible to think them to be false. Nor is it lawful to deem false that which is held by faith, since it is so evidently confirmed by God. Seeing then that the false alone is opposed to the true, as evidently appears if we examine their definitions, it is impossible for the aforesaid truth of faith to be contrary to those principles which reason knows naturally. Again, the same thing which the disciple's mind receives from its teacher is contained in the knowledge of the teacher, unless he teach insincerely, which it were wicked to say of God. Now the knowledge of naturally known principles is instilled into us by God, since God himself is the author of our nature. Therefore, the divine wisdom also contains these principles. Consequently, whatever is contrary to these principles is contrary to the divine wisdom. Wherefore, it cannot be from God. Therefore, those things which are received by faith from divine revelation cannot be contrary to our natural knowledge. Moreover, our intellect is stayed by contrary arguments, so that it cannot advance to the knowledge of truth. Wherefore, if conflicting knowledges were instilled into us by God, our intellect would thereby be hindered from knowing the truth, and this cannot be ascribed to God. Furthermore, things that are natural are unchangeable so long as nature remains. Now, contrary opinions cannot be together in the same subject. Therefore, God does not instill into man any opinion or belief contrary to natural knowledge. Hence the Apostle says in Romans 10:8, "The word is nigh thee, even in thy heart and in thy mouth. This is the word of faith which we preach. Yet because it surpasses reason, some look upon it as though it were contrary thereto, which is impossible. This is confirmed also by the authority of Augustine, who says, in the literal meaning of Genesis 2, that which truth shall make known can no wise be in opposition to the holy books, whether of the Old or of the New Testament. From this, we may evidently conclude that whatever arguments are alleged against the teachings of faith, they do not rightly proceed from the first self-evident principles instilled by nature. Wherefore, they lack the force of demonstration and are either probable or sophistical arguments, and consequently, it is possible to solve them. Chapter 8. In what relation human reason stands to the truth of faith. It would also seem well to observe that sensible things from which human reason derives the source of its knowledge retain a certain trace of likeness to God, but so imperfect that it proves altogether inadequate to manifest the substance itself of God. For effects resemble their causes according to their own mode, since like action proceeds from like agent. And yet the effect does not always reach to a perfect likeness to the agent. Accordingly, human reason is adapted to the knowledge of the truth of faith, which can be known in the highest degree only by those who see the divine substance, insofar as it is able to put together certain probable arguments in support thereof, which nevertheless are insufficient to enable us to understand the aforesaid truth as though it were demonstrated to us, or understood by us in itself. And yet, however weak these arguments may be, it is useful for the human mind to be practiced therein, so long as it does not pride itself on having comprehended or demonstrated. Since although our view of the sublimest things is limited and weak, it is most pleasant to be able to catch but a glimpse of them, as appears from what has been said. The authority of Hilary is in agreement with this statement, for he says in his work on the Trinity, while speaking of this same truth, "Begin by believing these things, advance and persevere, and though I know thou wilt not arrive, I shall rejoice at thy advance. For he who devoutly follows in pursuit of the infinite, though he never come up with it, will always advance by setting forth. Yet pry not into that secret, and meddle not in the mystery of the birth of the infinite, nor presume to grasp that which is the summit of understanding, but understand that there are things thou canst not grasp." Chapter 9. Of the order and mode of procedure in this work. Accordingly, from what we have been saying, it is evident that the intention of the wise man must be directed to the twofold truth of divine things and to the refutation of contrary errors, and that the research of reason is able to reach to one of these, while the other surpasses every effort of reason. And I speak of a twofold truth of divine things, not on the part of God himself, who is truth, one and simple, but on the part of our knowledge, the relation of which to the knowledge of divine things varies. Wherefore, in order to deduce the first kind of truth, we must proceed by demonstrative arguments, whereby we can convince our adversaries. But since such arguments are not available in support of the second kind of truth, our intention must be not to convince our opponent by our arguments, but to solve the arguments which he brings against the truth. Because, as shown above, natural reason cannot be opposed to the truth of faith. In a special way, may the opponent of this kind of truth be convinced by the authority of Scripture confirmed by God with miracles, since we believe not what is above human reason, save because God has revealed it. In support, however, of this kind of truth, certain probable arguments must be adduced for the practice and help of the faithful, but not for the conviction of our opponents, because the very insufficiency of these arguments would rather confirm them in their error, if they thought that we assented to the truth of faith on account of such weak reasonings. With the intention, then, of proceeding in the manner laid down, we shall first of all endeavor to declare that truth which is the object of faith's confession and of reason's researches, by adducing arguments both demonstrative and probable, some of which we have gathered from the writings of the philosophers and of holy men, so as thereby to confirm the truth and convince our opponents. After this, so as to proceed from the more to the less manifest, we shall, with God's help, proceed to declare that truth which surpasses reason by refuting the arguments of our opponents, and by setting forth the truth of faith by means of probable arguments and authority. Seeing, then, that we intend by the way of reason to pursue those things about God which human reason is able to investigate, the first object that offers itself to our consideration consists in those things which pertain to God in himself. The second will be the procession of creatures from him, and the third, the relation of creatures to him as their end. Of those things which we need to consider about God in himself, we must give the first place, this being the necessary foundation of the whole of this work, to the question of demonstrating that there is a God, for unless this be established, all questions about divine things are out of court. Chapter 10. Of the opinion of those who aver that it cannot be demonstrated that there is a God, since this is self-evident. Possibly it will seem to some that it is useless to endeavor to show that there is a God. They say that it is self-evident that God is, so that it is impossible to think the contrary, and thus it cannot be demonstrated that there is a God. The reasons for this view are as follow. Those things are said to be self-evident, which are known as soon as the terms are known. Thus, as soon as it is known what is a whole and what is a part, it is known that the whole is greater than its part. Now such is the statement, God is. For by this word God, we understand a thing a greater than which cannot be thought of. This is what a man conceives in his mind when he hears and understands this word, God, so that God must already be at least in his mind. Nor can he be in the mind alone, for that which is both in the mind and in reality is greater than that which is in the mind only. And the very signification of the word shows that nothing is greater than God. Wherefore it follows that it is self-evident that God is, since it is made clear from the very signification of the word. Again, it is possible to think that there is a thing which cannot be thought not to exist, and such a thing is evidently greater than that which can be thought not to exist. Therefore, if God can be thought not to exist, it follows that something can be thought greater than God, and this is contrary to the signification of the term. Therefore, it remains that it is self-evident that God is. Further, those propositions are most evident in which the self-same thing is predicated of itself. For instance, man is man, or wherein the predicate is included in the definition of the subject. For instance, man is an animal. Now, as we shall show further on, in God alone do we find that his being is his essence, as though the same were the answer to the question, what is he? As to the question, is he? Accordingly, when we say, God is, the predicate is either identified with the subject, or at least is included in the definition of the subject, and thus it will be self-evident that God is. Moreover, things that are known naturally are self-evident, for it is not by a process of research that they become evident. Now, it is naturally known that God is, since man's desire tends naturally to God as his last end, as we shall show further on. Therefore, it is self-evident that God is. Again, that whereby all things are known must needs be self-evident. Now such is God. For just as the light of the sun is the principle of all visual perception, so the divine light is the principle of all intellectual knowledge, because it is therein that first and foremost intellectual light is to be found. Therefore, it must needs be self-evident that God is. On account of these and like arguments, some are of the opinion that it is so self-evident that God is, that it is impossible for the mind to think the contrary. Chapter 11. Refutation of the foregoing opinion, and solution of the aforesaid arguments. The foregoing opinion arose from their being accustomed from the beginning to hear and call upon the name of God. Now custom, especially if it date from our childhood, acquires the force of nature, the result being that the mind holds those things with which it was imbued from childhood as firmly as though they were self-evident. It is also a result of failing to distinguish between what is self-evident simply and that which is self-evident to us. For it is simply self-evident that God is, because the self-same thing which God is his existence. But since we are unable to conceive mentally the self-same thing which is God, that thing remains unknown in regard to us. Thus, it is self-evident simply that every whole is greater than its part, but to one who fails to conceive mentally the meaning of a whole, it must needs be unknown. Hence it is that those things which are most evident of all are to the intellect what the sun is to the eye of an owl, as stated in Metaphysics 2. Nor does it follow, as the first argument alleged, that as soon as the meaning of the word God is understood, it is known that God is. First, because it is not known to all, even to those who grant that there is a God, that God is that thing than which no greater can be thought of, since many of the ancients asserted that this world is God. Nor can any such conclusion be gathered from the significations which Damascene assigns to this word God. Secondly, because, granted that everyone understands this word God to signify something than which a greater cannot be thought of, it does not follow that something than which a greater cannot be thought of exists in reality. For we must needs allege a thing in the same way as we allege the signification of its name. Now, from the fact that we conceive mentally that which the word God is intended to convey, it does not follow that God is otherwise than in the mind. Wherefore, neither will it follow that the thing than which a greater cannot be thought of is otherwise than in the mind. And thence it does not follow that there exists in reality something than which a greater cannot be thought of. Hence, this is no argument against those who assert that there is no God, since whatever be granted to exist, whether in reality or in the mind, there is nothing to prevent a person from thinking of something greater, unless he grants that there is in reality something than which a greater cannot be thought of. Again, it does not follow, as the second argument pretended, that if it is possible to think that God is not, it is possible to think of something greater than God. For that it be possible to think that he is not, it is not on account of the imperfection of his being, or the uncertainty thereof, since in itself his being is supremely manifest, but is the result of the weakness of our mind which is able to see him, not in himself, but in his effects, so that it is led by reasoning to know that he is. Wherefore the third argument is also solved. For just as it is self-evident to us that a whole is greater than its part, so is it most evident to those who see the very essence of God that God exists, since his essence is his existence. But because we are unable to see his essence, we come to know his existence not in himself, but in his effects. The solution to the fourth argument is also clear. for man knows God naturally, in the same way as he desires him naturally. Now man desires him naturally insofar as he naturally desires happiness, which is a likeness of the divine goodness. Hence, it does not follow that God considered in himself is naturally known to man, but that his likeness is. Wherefore man must needs come by reasoning to know God in the likeness to him which he discovers in God's effects. It is also easy to reply to the fifth argument. For God is that in which all things are known, not so that other things be unknown, except he be known, as happens in self-evident principles, but because all knowledge is caused in us by his outpouring. Chapter 12. Of the opinion of those who say that the existence of God cannot be proved, and that it is held by faith alone. The position that we have taken is also assailed by the opinion of certain others, whereby the efforts of those who endeavored to prove that there is a God would again be rendered futile. For they say that it is impossible by means of the reason to discover that God exists, and that this knowledge is acquired solely by means of faith and revelation. In making this assertion, some were moved by the weakness of the arguments which certain people employed to prove the existence of God. Possibly, however, this error might falsely seek support from the statements of certain philosophers who show that in God essence and existence are the same, namely that which answers to the question, "What is he?" and that which answers to the question, "Is he?" Now, it is impossible by the process of reason to acquire the knowledge of what God is. Wherefore, seemingly, neither is it possible to prove by reason whether God is. Again, if as required by the system of the philosopher, in order to prove whether a thing is, we must take as principle the signification of its name, and since according to the philosopher in Fourth Metaphysics, the signification of a name is its definition, there will remain no means of proving the existence of God, seeing that we lack knowledge of the divine essence or quiddity. Again, if the principles of demonstration become known to us originally through the senses, as is proved in the posterior analytics, those things which transcend all sense and sensible objects are seemingly indemonstrable. Now such is the existence of God. Therefore, it cannot be demonstrated. The falseness of this opinion is shown to us first by the art of demonstration, which teaches us to conclude causes from effects. Secondly, by the order itself of sciences. For if no substance above sensible substance can be an object of science, there will be no science above physics, as stated in Fourth Metaphysics. Thirdly, by the efforts of the philosophers who have endeavored to prove the existence of God. Fourthly, by the apostolic truth which asserts, in Romans 1:20, that the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Nor should we be moved by the consideration that in God essence and existence are the same, as the first argument contended. For this is to be understood of the existence by which God subsists in himself, of which we are ignorant as to what kind of a thing it is, even as we are ignorant of his essence. But it is not to be understood of that existence which is signified by the composition of the mind. For in this way it is possible to prove the existence of God, when our mind is led by demonstrative arguments to form a proposition stating that God is. Moreover, in those arguments whereby we prove the existence of God, it is not necessary that the divine essence or quiddity be employed as the middle term, as the second argument supposed. But instead of the quiddity, we take his effects as middle term, as is the case in a posteriori reasoning. And from these effects, we take the signification of this word, God. For all the divine names are taken either from the remoteness of God's effects from himself, or from some relationship between God and his effects. It is also evident from the fact that, although God transcends all sensibles and senses, his effects from which we take the proof that God exists are sensible objects. Hence our knowledge, even of things which transcend the senses, originates from the senses. Chapter 13. Arguments in proof of God's existence. Having shown, then, that it is not futile to endeavor to prove the existence of God, we may proceed to set forth the reasons whereby both philosophers and Catholic doctors have proved that there is a God. In the first place, we shall give the arguments by which Aristotle sets out to prove God's existence, and he aims at proving this from the point of view of movement in two ways. The first way is as follows. Whatever is in motion is moved by another, and it is clear to the sense that something, the sun for instance, is in motion. Therefore, it is set in motion by something else moving it. Now that which moves is itself either moved or not. If it not be moved, then the point is proved that we must needs postulate an immovable mover, and this we call God. If, however, it be moved, it is moved by another mover. Either, therefore, we must proceed to infinity, or we must come to an immovable mover. But it is not possible to proceed to infinity. Therefore, it is necessary to postulate an immovable mover. This argument contains two propositions that need to be proved, namely, that whatever is in motion is moved by another, and that it is not possible to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved. The first of these is proved by the philosopher in three ways. First, thus: if a thing moves itself, it must needs have the principle of its movement in itself, else it would clearly be moved by another. Again, it must be moved primarily. That is, it must be moved by reason of itself, and not by reason of its part, as an animal is moved by the movement of its foot, for in a latter way, not the whole but the part would be moved by itself, and one part by another. Again, it must be divisible and have parts, since whatever is moved is divisible, as is proved in the 6th book of Physics. These things being supposed, he argues as follows. That which is stated to be moved by itself is moved primarily. Therefore, if one of its parts is at rest, it follows that the whole is at rest. For if, while one part is at rest, another of its parts were in motion, the whole itself would not be moved primarily, but its part which is in motion while another is at rest. Now nothing that is at rest while another is at rest is moved by itself, for that which is at rest, as a result of another thing being at rest, must needs be in motion as a result of the other's motion, and hence it is not moved by itself. Hence that which was stated to be moved by itself is not moved by itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must needs be moved by another. Nor is this argument traversed by the statement that might be made that supposing a thing moves itself, it is impossible for a part thereof to be at rest, or again by the statement that to be at rest or in motion does not belong to a part except accidentally, as Avicenna quibbles. Because the force of the argument lies in this, that if a thing moves itself primarily and of itself, not by reason of its parts, it follows that its being moved does not depend on something, whereas with a divisible thing, being moved, like being, depends on its parts, so that it cannot move itself primarily and of itself. Therefore, the truth of the conclusion drawn does not require that we suppose as an absolute truth that a part of that which moves itself is at rest, but that this conditional statement be true that, if a part were at rest, the whole would be at rest, which statement can be true even if the antecedent be false, even as this conditional proposition is true. If a man is an ass, he is irrational. Secondly, he proves it by induction, thus: a thing is not moved by itself if it is moved accidentally, since its motion is occasioned by the motion of something else. Nor again if it is moved by force, as is manifest. Nor if it is moved by its nature like those things whose movement proceeds from themselves, such as animals, which clearly are moved by their souls. Nor if it is moved by nature, as heavy and light things are, since these are moved by their generating cause and by that which removes the obstacle to their movement. Now whatsoever things are in motion are moved either per se or accidentally, and if per se, either by force or by nature, and if the latter, either by something in them, as in the case of animals, or not by something in them, as in the case of heavy and light bodies. Therefore, whatever is in motion is moved by another. Thirdly, he proves his point thus: nothing is at the same time in act and in potentiality in respect of the same thing. Now whatever is in motion, as such, is in potentiality, because motion is the act of that which is in potentiality as such, whereas whatever moves, as such, is in act, for nothing acts except insofar as it is in act. Therefore nothing is both mover and moved in respect of the same movement, hence nothing moves itself. We must observe, however, that Plato, who asserted that every mover is moved, employed the term movement in a more general sense than Aristotle. For Aristotle took movement in its strict sense, for the act of a thing that is in potentiality as such, in which sense it applies only to divisible things and bodies, as is proved in the 6th book of Physics. Whereas, according to Plato, that which moves itself is not a body, for he took movement for any operation, so that to understand or to think is a kind of movement, to which manner of speaking Aristotle alludes in the 3rd book of De Anima. In this sense, then, he said that the first mover moves itself, inasmuch as it understands, desires, and loves itself. This, in a certain respect, is not in contradiction with the arguments of Aristotle, for it makes no difference whether with Plato we come to a first mover that moves itself, or with Aristotle to something first which is altogether immovable. He proves the other proposition, namely, that it is impossible to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved, by 3 arguments. The first of these is as follows. If one were to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved, all this infinite number of things would necessarily be bodies, since whatever is moved is divisible and corporeal, as is proved in the 6th book of Physics. Now every body that moves through being moved is moved at the same time as it moves. Therefore all this infinite number of things are moved at the same time as one of them is moved. But one of them, since it is finite, is moved in a finite time. Therefore all this infinite number of things are moved in a finite time. But this is impossible. Therefore it is impossible to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved. That it is impossible for the aforesaid infinite number of things to be moved in a finite time, he proves thus. Mover and moved must needs be simultaneous, and he proves this by induction from each species of movement. But bodies cannot be simultaneous except by continuity or contact. Wherefore, since all the aforesaid movers and things moved are bodies, as proved, they must needs be as one movable thing through their continuity or contact. And thus one infinite thing would be moved in a finite time, which is shown to be impossible in the 6th book of Physics. The second argument in proof of the same statement is as follows. In an ordinate series of movers and things moved, where namely throughout the series one is moved by the other, we must needs find that if the first mover be taken away or cease to move, none of the others will move or be moved, because the first is the cause of movement in all the others. Now, if an ordinate series of movers and things moved proceed to infinity, there will be no first mover, but all will be intermediate movers, as it were. Therefore, it will be impossible for any of them to be moved, and thus nothing in the world will be moved. The third argument amounts to the same, except that it proceeds in the reverse order, namely by beginning from above, and it is as follows. That which moves instrumentally cannot move unless there be something that moves principally. But if we proceed to infinity in movers and things moved, they will all be like instrumental movers, because they will be alleged to be moved movers, and there will be nothing by way of principal mover. Therefore, nothing will be moved. We have thus clearly proved both statements, which were supposed in the first process of demonstration, whereby Aristotle proved the existence of a first immovable mover. The second way is as follows. If every mover is moved, this statement is true either in itself or accidentally. If accidentally, it follows that it is not necessary, for that which is accidentally true is not necessary. Therefore, it is a contingent proposition that no mover is moved. But if a mover not be moved, it does not move, as the opponent asserts. Therefore, it is contingent that nothing is moved, since if nothing moves, nothing is moved. Now, Aristotle holds this to be impossible, namely, that at any time there be no movement. Therefore, the first proposition was not contingent, because a false impossibility does not follow from a false contingency. And therefore this proposition, every mover is moved by another, was not accidentally true. Again, if any two things are found accidentally united in a certain subject, and one of them is to be found without the other, it is probable that the latter can be found without the former. Thus, if white and musical are found in Socrates, and musical without white is found in Plato, it is probable that it is possible to find white without musical in some subject. Accordingly, if mover and moved be united together in some subject accidentally, and it be found that a certain thing is moved without its being a mover, it is probable that a mover is to be found that is not moved. Nor can one urge against this the case of two things, one of which depends on the other, because those in question are united not per se, but accidentally. If, however, the aforesaid proposition is true in itself, again there follows something impossible or unfitting. For the mover must needs be moved either by the same kind of movement or by another kind. If by the same kind, it follows that whatever causes alteration must itself be altered, and furthermore, that the healer must be healed, that the teacher must be taught, and in respect of the same science. But this is impossible, for the teacher must needs have science, while the learner must needs not have it, and thus the same will be both possessed and not possessed by the same, which is impossible. And if it be moved by another kind of movement, so that, to wit, that which causes alteration be moved in respect of place, and that which moves in respect of place be increased, and so on, it will follow that we cannot go on indefinitely, since the genera and species of movement are finite in number. And thus there will be some first mover that is not moved by another, unless perchance someone say that a recurrence takes place, in this way that when all the genera and species of movement have been exhausted, a return must be made to the first. For instance, if that which moves in respect of place be altered, and that which causes alteration be increased, then again that which is increased to be moved in respect of place. But the consequence of this will be the same as before, namely, that which moves by one kind of movement is itself moved by the same kind, not immediately indeed, but mediately. It remains, therefore, that we must needs postulate some first mover that is not moved by anything outside itself. Since, however, given that there is a first mover that is not moved by anything outside itself, it does not follow that it is absolutely immovable. Aristotle proceeds further, saying that this may happen in two ways. First, so that this first mover is absolutely immovable. And if this be granted, our point is established, namely, that there is a first immovable mover. Secondly, that this first mover is moved by itself. And this seems probable, because what is of itself is always prior to what is of another. Wherefore also in things moved, it is logical that what is moved first is moved by itself and not by another. But if this be granted, the same consequence follows. For it cannot be said that the whole of that which moves itself is moved by its whole self, because then the absurd consequences mentioned above would follow, namely that a person might teach and be taught at the same time, and in like manner as to other kinds of movement. And again that a thing would be at the same time in act and in potentiality, since a mover as such is in act, while that which is moved is in potentiality. It remains therefore that one part thereof is mover only, and the other part moved. And thus we have the same conclusion as before, namely that there is something that moves, and is itself immovable. And it cannot be said that both parts are moved so that one is moved by the other, nor that one part moves both itself and the other, nor that the whole moves a part, nor that part moves the whole, since the above absurdities would follow, namely that something would both move and be moved by the same kind of movement, and that it would be at the same time in potentiality and in act, and moreover, that the whole would move itself not primarily, but by reason of its part. It remains, therefore, that in that which moves itself, one part must be immovable, and must move the other part. Since, however, in those things among us which move themselves, namely animals, the part which moves, namely the soul, although immovable of itself, is nevertheless moved accidentally. He goes on to show that in the first mover, the part which moves is not moved neither of itself nor accidentally. For in those things which among us move themselves, namely animals, since they are corruptible, the part which moves is moved accidentally. Now those corruptible things which move themselves must needs be reducible to some first mover that is everlasting. Therefore, that which moves itself must have a mover which is moved neither of itself nor accidentally. It is clear that, in accordance with his hypothesis, some self-mover must be everlasting. For if, as he supposes, movement is everlasting, the production of these self-movers that are subject to generation and corruption must be everlasting. But no one of these self-movers, since it does not always exist, can be the cause of this everlastingness. Nor can all of them together, both because they would be infinite, and because they do not exist altogether. It follows, therefore, that there must be an everlasting self-mover that causes the everlastingness of generation in these lower self-movers. And thus its mover is not moved, neither of itself nor accidentally. Again, we observe that in self-movers, some begin to be moved anew on account of some movement whereby the animal is not moved by itself, for instance, by the digestion of food or a change in the atmosphere, by which movement the mover that moves itself is moved accidentally. Whence we may gather that no self-mover, whose mover is moved per se or accidentally, is always moved. But the first self-mover is always in motion, else movement could not be everlasting, since every other movement is caused by the movement of the first self-mover. It follows, therefore, that the first self-mover is moved by a mover who is not moved, neither per se nor accidentally. Nor is this argument rebutted by the fact that the movers of the lower spheres cause an everlasting movement, and yet are said to be moved accidentally. For they are said to be moved accidentally not by reason of themselves, but by reason of the things subject to their motion, which follow the motion of the higher sphere. Since, however, God is not part of a self-mover, Aristotle goes on in his Metaphysics to trace from this motor, that is a part of a self-mover, another mover altogether separate, which is God. For since every self-mover is moved through its appetite, it follows that the motor, that is a part of a self-mover, moves on account of the appetite for some appetible object. And this object is above the motor in moving because the appetent is a moved mover, whereas the appetible is a mover altogether unmoved. Therefore, there must needs be a first mover, separate and altogether immovable, and this is God. Now, two things would seem to weaken the above arguments. The first of these is that they proceed from the supposition of the eternity of movement, and among Catholics this is supposed to be false. To this we reply that the most effective way to prove God's existence is from the supposition of the eternity of the world, which being supposed, it seems less manifest that God exists. For if the world and movement had a beginning, it is clear that we must suppose some cause to have produced the world and movement, because whatever becomes anew must take its origin from some cause of its becoming, since nothing evolves itself from potentiality to act, or from non-being to being. The second is that the aforesaid arguments suppose that the first moved thing, namely the heavenly body, has its motive principle in itself, whence it follows that it is animated, and by many this is not granted. To this we reply that if the first mover is not supposed to have its motive principle in itself, it follows that it is immediately moved by something altogether immovable. Hence also Aristotle draws this conclusion with an alternative, namely, that either we must come at once to a first mover immovable and separate, or to a self-mover from which again we come to a first mover immovable and separate. The philosopher proceeds in a different way in his second book of Metaphysics, to show that it is impossible to proceed to infinity in efficient causes, and that we must come to one first cause, and this we call God. This is how he proceeds. In all efficient causes following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate, whether the intermediate be one or several. Now if the cause be removed, that which it causes is removed. Therefore, if we remove the first, the intermediate cannot be a cause. But if we go on to infinity in efficient causes, no cause will be first. Therefore, all the others which are intermediate will be removed. Now this is clearly false. Therefore we must suppose the existence of a first efficient cause, and this is God. Another reason can be drawn from the words of Aristotle, for in the second book of Metaphysics, he shows that those things which excel as true excel as beings. And in the fourth book of Metaphysics, he shows that there is something supremely true from the fact that we see that of two false things one is falser than the other, wherefore it follows that one also is truer than the other. Now this is by reason of the approximation to that which is simply and supremely true. Wherefore we may further conclude that there is something that is supremely being, and this we call God. Another argument in support of this conclusion is adduced by Damascene from the government of things, and the same reasoning is indicated by the commentator in the second book on physics. It runs as follows: "It is impossible for contrary and discordant things to accord in one order, always or frequently, except by someone's governance, whereby each and all are made to tend to a definite end. Now we see that in the world, things of different natures accord in one order, not seldom and fortuitously, but always or for the most part. Therefore it follows that there is someone by whose providence the world is governed, and this we call God." Chapter 14. That in order to acquire knowledge of God, it is necessary to proceed by the way of remotion. Accordingly, having proved that there is a first being which we call God, it behooves us to inquire into his nature. Now, in treating of the divine essence, the principal method to be followed is that of remotion. For the divine essence, by its immensity, surpasses every form to which our intellect reaches, and thus we cannot apprehend it by knowing what it is. But we have some knowledge thereof by knowing what it is not, and we shall approach all the nearer to the knowledge thereof according as we shall be enabled to remove by our intellect a greater number of things therefrom. For the more completely we see how a thing differs from others, the more perfectly we know it, since each thing has in itself its own being distinct from all other things. Wherefore, when we know the definition of a thing, first we place it in a genus, whereby we know in general what it is, and afterwards we add differences, so as to mark its distinction from other things, and thus we arrive at the complete knowledge of a thing's essence. Since, however, we are unable in treating of the divine essence to take what as a genus, nor can we express its distinction from other things by affirmative differences, we must needs express it by negative differences. Now, just as in affirmative differences one restricts another and brings us the nearer to a complete description of the thing, according as it makes it to differ from more things, so one negative difference is restricted by another that marks a distinction from more things. Thus, if we say that God is not an accident, we thereby distinguish him from all accidents. And if we add that he is not a body, we shall distinguish him also from certain substances, and thus, in gradation, he will be differentiated by such like negations from all beside himself. And then when he is known as distinct from all things, we shall arrive at a proper consideration of him. It will not, however, be perfect, because we shall not know what he is in himself. Wherefore, in order to proceed about the knowledge of God by the way of remotion, let us take as principle that which is already made manifest by what we have said above, namely, that God is altogether unchangeable. This is also confirmed by the authority of Holy Writ. For it is said in Malachi 3:6, "I am God, and I change not." And in James 1:17, "With whom there is no change." And in Numbers 23:19, "God is not as man, that he should be changed." Chapter 15. That God is eternal. From the foregoing, it is also clear that God is eternal. For whatever begins or ceases to be, suffers this through movement or change. Now it has been shown that God is altogether unchangeable. Therefore he is eternal, having neither beginning nor end. Again, only things which are moved are measured by time, because time is the measure of movement, as stated in the fourth book of Physics. Now God is absolutely without movement, as we have already proved. Therefore, we cannot mark before and after in him. Therefore, in him there is not being after non-being, nor can he have non-being after being, nor is it possible to find any succession in his being, because these things cannot be understood apart from time. Therefore, he is without beginning and end, and has all his being simultaneously, and in this consists the notion of eternity. Moreover, if anywhen he was not and afterwards was, he was brought by someone out of non-being into being, not by himself, because what is not cannot do anything. And if by another, this other is prior to him. Nor has it been shown that God is the first cause. Therefore, he did not begin to be. Therefore, neither will he cease to be, because that which always was has the power to be always. Therefore, he is eternal. Furthermore, we observe that in the world there are certain things which can be and not be, namely those that are subject to generation and corruption. Now whatsoever is possible to be has a cause, because as in itself it is equally related to two things, namely being and not being, it follows that if it acquires being, this is the result of some cause. But as proved above by Aristotle's argument, we cannot go on to infinity in causes. Therefore, we must suppose some thing which it is necessary to be. Now, every necessary thing either has a cause of its necessity from without, or has no such cause, but is necessary of itself. But we cannot go on to infinity in necessary things that have causes of their necessity from without. Therefore, we must suppose some first necessary thing which is necessary of itself. And this is God, since he is the first cause, as proved above. Therefore, God is eternal, since whatever is necessary of itself is eternal. Again, Aristotle proves the everlastingness of movement from the everlastingness of time, and thence he goes on to prove the everlastingness of the substance that is the cause of movement. Now the first moving substance is God. Therefore, he is everlasting. And supposing the everlastingness of time and movement to be denied, there still remains the argument and proof of the everlastingness of substance. For if movement had a beginning, it must have had its beginning from some mover. And if this mover had a beginning, it had its beginning from some agent. And thus either we shall go on to infinity, or we shall come to something without a beginning. Divine authority bears witness to this truth. Wherefore the psalm reads, "But thou, O Lord, endurest forever." And again, "But thou art always the selfsame, and thy years shall not fail." Chapter 16. That in God there is no passive potentiality. Now if God is eternal, it follows of necessity that he is not in potentiality. For everything in whose substance there is an admixture of potentiality is possibly non-existent as regards whatever it has of potentiality, for that which may possibly be, may possibly not be. Now God in himself cannot not be, since he is eternal. Therefore in God there is no potentiality to be. Again, although that which is sometimes potential and sometimes actual is in point of time potential before being actual, nevertheless actuality is simply before potentiality, because potentiality does not bring itself into actuality, but needs to be brought into actuality by something actual. Therefore, whatever is in any way potential has something previous to it. Now God is the first being and the first cause, as stated above. Therefore in him there is no admixture of potentiality. Again, that which of itself must necessarily be can no wise be possibly, since what of itself must be necessarily has no cause, whereas whatever can be possibly has a cause as proved above. Now God, in himself, must necessarily be. Therefore, nowise can he be possibly. Therefore, no potentiality is to be found in his essence. Again, everything acts according as it is actual. Wherefore, that which is not wholly actual acts, not by its whole self, but by part of itself. Now that which does not act by its whole self is not the first agent, since it acts by participation of something and not by its essence. Therefore, the first agent, which is God, has no admixture of potentiality, but is pure act. Moreover, just as it is natural that a thing should act insofar as it is actual, so it is natural for it to be passive insofar as it is in potentiality. For movement is the act of that which is in potentiality. Now God is altogether impassible and immovable, as stated above. Therefore, in him there is no potentiality, namely, that which is passive. Further, we notice in the world something that passes from potentiality to actuality. Now, it does not reduce itself from potentiality to actuality, because that which is potential is not yet, wherefore neither can it act. Therefore, it must be preceded by something else whereby it can be brought from potentiality to actuality. And if this again passes from potentiality to actuality, it must be preceded by something else, whereby it can be brought from potentiality to actuality. But we cannot go on thus to infinity. Therefore, we must come to something that is wholly actual and nowise potential. And this we call God. Chapter 17. That in God there is no matter. From this it follows that God is not matter. For matter, such as it is in potentiality. Again, matter is not a principle of activity. Wherefore, as the philosopher puts it, efficient and material causes do not coincide. Now, as stated above, it belongs to God to be the first efficient cause of things. Therefore, he is not matter. Moreover, for those who referred all things to matter as their first cause, it followed that natural things exist by chance. And against these it is argued in the second book of Physics. Therefore, if God, who is the first cause, is the material cause of things, it follows that all things exist by chance. Further, matter does not become the cause of an actual thing except by being altered and changed. Therefore, if God is immovable, as proved above, he can nowise be a cause of things as their matter. The Catholic faith professes this truth, asserting that God created all things not out of his substance, but out of nothing. The ravings of David of Dinan are hereby confounded, who dared to assert that God is the same as primary matter, because if they were not the same, they would needs differ by certain differences, and thus they would not be simple, since in that which differs from another thing by a difference, the very difference argues composition. Now this proceeded from his ignorance of the distinction between difference and diversity. For as laid down in the 10th book of Metaphysics, a thing is said to be different in relation to something, because whatever is different differs by something, whereas things are said to be diverse absolutely, from the fact that they are not the same thing. Accordingly, we must seek for a difference in things which have something in common, for we have to point to something in them whereby they differ. Thus two species have a common genus, wherefore they must needs be distinguished by differences. But in those things which have nothing in common, we have not to seek in what they differ, for they are diverse by themselves. For thus are opposite differences distinguished from one another, because they do not participate in a genus as a part of their essence, and consequently we must not ask in what they differ, for they are diversified by their very selves. Thus too, God and primary matter are distinguished, since, the one being pure act, and the other pure potentiality, they have nothing in common. Chapter 18. That in God there is no composition. From the foregoing, we are able to conclude that there is no composition in God. For in every composite thing there must needs be act and potentiality. Since several things cannot become one simply, unless there be something actual there and something else potential. Because those things that are actually are not united except as an assemblage or group, which are not one simply. In these, moreover, the very parts that are gathered together are as a potentiality in relation to the union, for they are actually united after being potentially unitable. But in God there is no potentiality. Therefore, in him there is no composition. Again, every composite is subsequent to its components. Therefore, the first being, namely God, has no component parts. Further, every composite is potentially dissoluble, so far as its composite nature is concerned, although in some there is something else incompatible with dissolution. Now that which is dissoluble is in potentiality to not being. But this cannot be said of God, since of his very essence he is necessarily. Therefore, there is no composition in him. Moreover, every composition requires a compounder, for if there be composition, it results from several things, and things that are several in themselves would not combine together unless they were united by a compounder. If then God were composite, he would have a compounder, for he could not compound himself, since no thing is its own cause, for it would precede itself, which is impossible. Now the compounder is the efficient cause of the composite. Therefore God would have an efficient cause, and thus he would not be the first cause, which was proved above. Again, in any genus the more simple a thing is, the more excellent it is. Such, in the genus hot, is fire which has no admixture of cold. Therefore that which obtains the summit of nobility among beings must be in the summit of simplicity. Now that which obtains the summit of nobility in things is what we call God, since he is the first cause, because the cause is more excellent than its effect. Therefore, there can be no composition in him. Moreover, in every composite thing, the good does not belong to this or that part, but to the whole, and I speak of good in reference to that goodness which is proper to, and is the perfection of, the whole. Thus the parts are imperfect in relation to the whole. Thus the parts of a man are not a man, nor have the parts of the number 6 the perfection of 6, nor do the parts of a line attain to the perfection of the measure found in the whole line. Therefore, if God is composite, his proper perfection and goodness are found in the whole of God, but not in any of his parts. And thus the good that is proper to him will not be purely in him, and consequently he will not be the first and supreme good. Further, before every multitude it is necessary to find unity. Now in every composite there is multitude. Therefore, that which is before all things, namely God, must needs be devoid of all composition. Chapter 19. That in God there is nothing violent or beside nature. Hence the philosopher concludes that in God there cannot be anything violent or outside nature. For whatever has in itself anything violent or beside nature has something added to itself, since that which belongs to a thing's essence cannot be violent or beside nature. Now no simple thing has in itself anything that is added, for this would argue its being composite. Since then God is simple, as shown above, there can be nothing in him that is violent or beside nature. Further, the necessity resulting from compulsion is a necessity imposed by another. Now in God there is no necessity imposed by another, for he is necessary of himself and the cause of necessity in other things. Therefore, nothing is compulsory in him. Moreover, wherever there is violence, there can be something besides what belongs to a thing by its very nature, since violence is contrary to that which is according to nature. But it is not possible for anything to be in God that does not belong to him according to his nature, since by his very nature he is necessary being, as shown above. Therefore, there can be nothing violent in him. Again, everything that is compelled or unnatural has a natural aptitude to be moved by another, because that which is done by compulsion has an external principle without any concurrence on the part of the patient. Confer the third book of Ethics 1:3. Now God is altogether immovable, as shown above. Therefore, nothing in him can be violent or unnatural. Chapter 20. That God is not a body. From the foregoing, we are also able to prove that God is not a body. For since every body is a continuous substance, it is composite and has parts. Now God is not composite, as we have shown. Therefore, he is not a body. Further, every quantitative substance is somehow in potentiality, for that which is continuous is potentially divisible to infinity, and number can be infinitely augmented. Now every body is a quantitative substance. Therefore every body is in potentiality. But God is not in potentiality, but is pure act, as shown above. Therefore, God is not a body. Again, if God were a body, he would needs be a physical body, for a mathematical body does not exist by itself, as the philosopher proves, since dimensions are accidents. Now he is not a physical body, for he is immovable, as we have proved, and every physical body is movable. Therefore God is not a body. Moreover, every body is finite, which is proved in regard both to spherical and to rectilinear bodies in the first book of Caeli et Mundi. Now we are unable by our intellect and imagination to soar above any finite body. Wherefore, if God were a body, our intellect and imagination would be able to think of something greater than God, and thus God would not exceed our intellect, which is inadmissible. Therefore, he is not a body. Furthermore, intellective knowledge is more certain than sensitive. Now among natural things we find some that are objects of sense. Therefore, there are also some that are objects of intellect. But the order of powers is according to the order of objects, in the same way as their distinction. Therefore, above all sensible objects, there is an intelligible object existing in natural things. But every body that exists among things is sensible. Therefore, above all bodies, it is possible to find something more excellent. Wherefore, if God were a body, he would not be the first and supreme being. Again, a living thing is more excellent than any body devoid of life. Now the life of a living body is more excellent than the body, since thereby it excels all other bodies. Therefore that which is excelled by nothing is not a body, but such is God. Therefore, he is not a body. Moreover, we find the philosophers proving the same conclusion by arguments based on the eternity of movement as follows. In all everlasting movement, the first mover must needs not be moved, neither per se nor accidentally, as we have proved above. Now the body of the heavens is moved in a circle with an everlasting movement. Therefore its first mover is not moved, neither per se nor accidentally. Now no body causes local movement unless itself be moved, because moved and mover must be simultaneous, and thus the body that causes movement must be itself moved in order to be simultaneous with the body that is moved. Moreover, no power in a body causes movement except it be moved accidentally, since when the body is moved, the power of that body is moved accidentally. Therefore, the first mover of the heavens is neither a body nor a power residing in a body. Now that to which the movement of the heavens is ultimately reduced as to the first immovable mover is God. Therefore, God is not a body. Again, no infinite power is a power residing in a magnitude, but the power of the first mover is an infinite power. Therefore, it does not reside in a magnitude, and thus God, who is the first mover, is neither a body nor a power residing in a body. The first proposition is proved as follows. If a power residing in a magnitude be infinite, this magnitude is either finite or infinite. But there is no infinite magnitude as proved in the third book of physics and in the first book of Caeli et Mundi, and it is not possible for a finite magnitude to have an infinite power. Therefore, in no magnitude can there be an infinite power. That there cannot be an infinite power in a finite magnitude is proved thus. A great power produces in less time an equal effect, which a lesser power produces in more time. Of whatever kind this effect may be, whether it be one of alteration, of local movement, or of any other kind of movement. Now an infinite power surpasses every finite power. It follows, therefore, that it produces its effect more rapidly by causing a more rapid movement than any finite power. Nor can this greater rapidity be one of time. Therefore it follows that the effect is produced in an indivisible point of time. And thus moving, being moved, and movement will be instantaneous, the contrary of which has been proved in the sixth book of physics. That an infinite power of a finite magnitude cannot cause movement in time is proved thus. Let A be an infinite power, and AB a part thereof. This part, therefore, will cause movement in more time. And yet there must be proportion between this time and the time in which the whole power causes movement, since both times are finite. Suppose, then, these two times to be in proportion as 1 to 10, for it does not affect this argument whether we take this or any other ratio. Now, if we increase the aforesaid finite power, we must decrease the time in proportion to the increase of the power, since a greater power causes movement in less time. If, therefore, we increase it tenfold, that power will cause movement in a time which will be 1/10 of the time occupied by the first part that we took of the infinite power, namely AB. And yet this power, which is 10 times the aforesaid power, is a finite power, since it has a fixed proportion to a finite power. It follows, therefore, that a finite power and an infinite power cause movement in an equal time, which is impossible. Therefore, an infinite power of a finite magnitude cannot cause movement in any time. That the power of the first mover is infinite is proved thus. No finite power can cause movement in an infinite time. Now the power of the first mover causes movement in an infinite time, since the first movement is eternal. Therefore the power of the first mover is infinite. The first proposition is proved thus. If any finite power of a body causes movement in infinite time, a part of that body having a part of that power will cause movement during less time, since the greater power a thing has, for so much the longer time will it be able to continue a movement, and thus the aforesaid part will cause movement in finite time, and a greater part will be able to cause movement during more time. And thus, always according as we increase the power of the mover, we increase the time in the same proportion. But if this increase be made a certain number of times, we shall come to the quantity of the whole, or even go beyond it. Therefore the increase also on the part of the time will reach the quantity of time wherein the whole causes movement. And yet the time wherein the whole causes movement was supposed to be infinite. Consequently, a finite time will measure an infinite time, which is impossible. However, there are several objections to this chain of reasoning. One of these is that it might be held that the body which moves the first thing moved is not divisible, as is the case of a heavenly body, whereas the argument given above supposes it to be divided. To this we reply that a conditional clause may be true, though its antecedent be impossible. And if there be anything to disprove such a conditional, the antecedent is impossible. Thus, if anyone disprove this conditional, if a man flies, he has wings, the antecedent would be impossible. It is in this way that we are to understand the process of the aforesaid reasoning. For this conditional is true, if a heavenly body be divided, its part will have less power than the whole. But this conditional is disproved if we suppose that the first mover is a body on account of the impossibilities that follow. Wherefore, it is clear that this is impossible. We can reply in the same way if objection be made to the increase of finite powers. Because it is impossible in natural things to find powers according to any proportion that there is between one time and any other time. And yet the conditional required in the aforesaid argument is true. The second objection is that, although a body be divided, it is possible for a power of a body not to be divided when the body is divided. Thus the rational soul is not divided when the body is divided. To this we reply that by the above argument, it is not proved that God is not united to the body as the rational soul is united to the human body, but that he is not a power residing in a body, as a material power which is divided when the body is divided. Wherefore, it is also said of the human intellect that it is neither a body nor a power in a body. That God is not united to the body as its soul is another question. The third objection is that if the power of every body is finite, as is proved in the above process, and if a finite power cannot make its effect to endure an infinite time, it will follow that no body can endure an infinite time, and consequently that a heavenly body will be necessarily corrupted. Some reply to this that a heavenly body, in respect of its own power, is defectible, but acquires everlastingness from another that has infinite power. Apparently Plato approves of this solution, for he represents God as speaking of the heavenly bodies as follows: "By your nature ye are corruptible, but by my will incorruptible, because my will is greater than your necessity." Confer the Timaeus 41. But the commentator refutes this solution in the 11th book of Metaphysics, for it is impossible, according to him, that what in itself may possibly not be should acquire everlastingness of being from another, since it would follow that the corruptible is changed into incorruptibility, and this, in his opinion, is impossible. Wherefore he replies after this fashion, that in a heavenly body whatever power there is finite, and yet it does not follow that it has all power. For, according to Aristotle in the 8th book of Metaphysics, the potentiality to be somewhere is in a heavenly body, but not the potentiality to be. And thus it does not follow that it has a potentiality to not be. It must be observed, however, that this reply of the commentator is insufficient. Because although it be granted that in a heavenly body there is no quasi-potentiality to be, which potentiality is that of matter, there is nevertheless in it a quasi-active potentiality, which is the power of being. Since Aristotle says explicitly in the first book, Celi et Mundi, that the heaven has the power to be always. Hence, it is better to reply that since power implies relation to act, we should judge of power according to the mode of the act. Now, movement by its very nature has quantity and extension, wherefore its infinite duration requires that the moving power should be infinite. On the other hand, being has no quantitative extension, especially in a thing whose being is invariable, such as the heaven. Hence it does not follow that the power of being a finite body is infinite, though its duration be infinite, because it matters not whether that power make a thing to last for an instant or for an infinite time, since that invariable being is not affected by time except accidentally. The fourth objection is that the statement that what causes movement in infinite time must have an infinite power does not necessarily apply to those movers which are not altered by moving, because such a movement consumes nothing of their power. Wherefore, they can cause movement for no less time after they have moved for a certain time than before. Thus the power of the sun is finite, and because its power is not diminished on account of its action, it can act on this lower world for an infinite time, according to nature. To this we reply that a body moves not unless it be moved, as we have shown. Therefore, supposing a body not to be moved, it follows that it does not move. Now, in anything that is moved, there is potentiality to opposites, since the terms of movement are opposite to one another. Consequently, considered in itself, every body that is moved is possibly not moved, and that which is possibly not moved is not apt of itself to be moved for an everlasting time, and consequently neither is it apt to move for a perpetual time. Accordingly, the demonstration given above is based on the finite power of a finite body, which power cannot of itself move in an infinite time. But a body which of itself is possibly moved and not moved, and possibly moves and does not move, can acquire perpetual movement from some cause, and this cause must needs be incorporeal. Wherefore, the first mover must needs be incorporeal. Hence, according to nature, nothing hinders a finite body which acquires from another cause perpetuity in being moved, from having also perpetuity in moving, since also the first heavenly body, according to nature, can cause a perpetual circular movement in the lower bodies according as one sphere moves another. Nor is it impossible, as the commentator maintains, for that which is of itself in potentiality to being moved and not moved, to acquire perpetual movement from something else, as he supposed it impossible as regards perpetuity of being. For movement is a kind of outflow from the mover to the thing movable, and consequently, a movable thing can acquire perpetual movement from something else without having it by nature. On the other hand, to be is something fixed and quiescent in a being, and consequently that which is, of itself, in potentiality to not be, cannot, as he says, in the course of nature, acquire from something else perpetuity of being. The fifth objection is that, According to the above reasoning, there does not appear to be more reason why there should not be an infinite power in a magnitude than outside a magnitude, for in either case it would follow that it moves in not time. To this it may be replied that finite and infinite are found in a magnitude, in time and in movement, in a univocal sense, as proved in the 3rd and 6th books of physics, wherefore the infinite in one of them removes a finite proportion in the others, whereas in things devoid of magnitude there is neither finite nor infinite, unless equivocally. Hence the above course of reasoning has no place in such like powers. But another and better answer is that the heaven has two movers. One is its proximate mover, which is of finite power, and thence it is that its movement is of finite velocity. The other is its remote mover, which is of infinite power, whence it is that its movement can be of infinite duration. Thus it is clear that an infinite power which is not in a magnitude can move a body not immediately in time, whereas a power which is in a magnitude must needs move immediately, since no body moves without itself being moved. Wherefore, if it moved, it would follow that it moves in not time. Better still, it may be replied that a power which is not in a magnitude is an intellect and moves by its will, wherefore it moves according to the requirement of the movable, and not according to the proportion of its strength. On the other hand, a power that is in a magnitude cannot move save by natural necessity, for it has been proved that the intellect is not a bodily force. Wherefore, it causes movement necessarily according to the proportion of its quantity. Hence it follows that if it moves anything, it moves it instantaneously. In this sense, then, the foregoing objections being refuted, proceeds the reasoning of Aristotle. Moreover, no movement that proceeds from a bodily mover can be continuous and regular, because a bodily mover, in local movement, moves by attraction or repulsion, and that which is attracted or repelled is not disposed in the same way towards its mover from the beginning to the end of the movement, since at one time it is nearer to it, and at another time further from it, and thus no body can cause a continuous and regular movement. On the other hand, the first movement is continuous and regular, as is proved in the 8th book of physics. Therefore, the mover of the first movement is not a body. Again, no movement that tends towards an end which passes from potentiality to actuality can be perpetual, since, when it arrives at actuality, the movement ceases. If, therefore, the first movement is perpetual, it must be towards an end which is always and in every way actual. Now such is neither a body nor a power residing in a body, because these are all movable either per se or accidentally. Therefore the end of the first movement is not a body nor a power residing in a body. Now the end of the first movement is the first mover, which moves as the object of desire, and that is God. Therefore, God is neither a body nor a power residing in a body. Now though, according to our faith, it is false that the movement of the heavens is everlasting, as we shall show further on. It is nevertheless true that the movement will not cease, either on account of lack of power in the mover, or on account of the substance of the movable being corrupted, since we do not find that the movement of the heavens slackens in the course of time. Wherefore the aforesaid proofs lose nothing of their efficacy. The truth thus demonstrated is in accordance with divine authority, for it is said in John chapter 4, verse 24, God is a spirit, and they that adore him must adore him in spirit and in truth. And again in 1 Timothy 1:17, to the King of ages, immortal, invisible, the only God. And in Romans 1:20, the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, For things that are clearly seen, not by the eye but by the mind, are incorporeal. Hereby is refuted the error of the early natural philosophers, who admitted none but material causes, such as fire, water, and the like, and consequently asserted that the first principles of things were bodies, and called them gods. Among these also there were some who held that the causes of movement were sympathy and antipathy, and these again are refuted by the above arguments. For since according to them sympathy and antipathy are in bodies, it would follow that the first principles of movement are forces residing in a body. They also asserted that God was composed of the four elements and sympathy, from which we gather that they held God to be a heavenly body. Among the ancients, Anaxagoras alone came near to the truth, since he affirmed that all things are moved by an intellect. By this truth, moreover, those heathens are refuted who maintained that the very elements of the world and the forces residing in them are gods. For instance, the sun, moon, earth, water, and so forth, being led astray by the errors of the philosophers mentioned above. Again, the above arguments confound the extravagances of the unlettered Jews, of Tertullian, of the Vadiani, or anthropomorphite heretics, who depicted God with human features, and again of the Manichees, who affirmed God to be an infinite substance composed of light and spread abroad throughout boundless space. The occasion of all these errors was that in their thoughts about divine things they had recourse to their imagination, which can reflect none but corporeal likenesses. Wherefore it behooves us to put the imagination aside when we meditate on things incorporeal.